Vi skal tale om udvikling og naturbevarelse, fordi det er en af de helt store udfordringer i verden lige nu og her. Jeg tror, vi er mange, der har hørt om det med klimaproblemerne, men biodiversitet bliver også et stadig større problem. Faktisk er det sådan, at bestanddelen af fugle, fisk og pattedyr er reduceret med 60% over de seneste 50 år. Det vi ser, det er altså, at det navnlig er i udviklingslandene, de fattigste lande, at man bliver ramt af de her problemer, selvom det måske nok så meget er os på den nordlige jordklode, der er skyld i det her.
Indrømmet, at det kan virke frustrerende uoverskueligt. Alle de her kriser. Vi har en klimakrise, vi har mangel på vand, vi har en coronakrise og humanitære kriser oveni. Og det er næsten umuligt at skaffe ressourcer nok til at løse de her problemer et problem ad gangen. Vi bliver nødt til at løse dem i en stor samlet pulje. Vi skal til at arbejde med naturen og være i pagt med naturen i fremtiden. Vi kan bruge naturen aktivt til at løse klimaproblemer og skabe udvikling og vækst. Naturbaserede løsninger, det er fremtidens udvikling.
Danmark er et lille land, men med globale ambitioner om at gøre en forskel netop på naturområdet. Jeg tror, det er vigtigt, at vi går foran med blandt andet partnerskaber, hvor vi involverer os, ligesom Verdensnaturfonden har gjort med Carlsberg og med Velux. Gå foran med private initiativer, som kan gøre en forskel. Det er vigtigt. Jeg tænker meget Danmark som det lille grønne tandhjul, som kan være med til at inspirere og trække de store sorte tandhjul den rigtige vej. Så Danmark er en global leder på det her område, og det skal vi fortsætte med at være.
Jeg tror godt, I ved alle sammen, at jeg elsker skovene, og jeg elsker naturen. Men jeg er faktisk nødt til at tage hjem fra skoven nu, fordi jeg glæder mig til at skulle tage ind og deltage i konferencen sammen med jer. Og mit mål, det er, at I skal komme til at elske naturbaserede løsninger lige så meget som mig.
Perfect. I'd like to welcome you all to this very exciting symposium we're going to have this afternoon. Welcoming you on behalf of WWF Denmark and the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in particular Minister Rasmus Prehn and Bo Øksnebjerg, the President or the CEO of WWF Denmark. I should let you know right away that we do have an audience which is both here inside the room, and we also have a virtual audience actually numbering hundreds of people from all across the globe. These kind of debates are these days attracting a lot of attention, and it's not strange that this is happening, exactly as we heard in my own native language. No, sorry, issues with the mic. The problem is oceans rising, deserts spreading out, and basically boundaries that are reaching absolutely threshold values where we're looking into the future that we cannot navigate unless we really understand that these kind of crises in biodiversity, nature, migration, poverty, etc., they are intrinsically the solutions that they must find is in the nexus between these challenges. So, having said that, we are going into a fantastic afternoon where we will first hear from the minister himself what he is actually thinking about this entire agenda. And that will provide a good basis from which we will hear perspectives from several key stakeholders on how we can enable and promote the use of nature-based solutions. We've been talking about this for many, many years, and we're now reaching a state where we do have standards in place and a toolbox that can actually be put into use. So before just inviting Rasmus Prehn, the minister, to take the floor, I would also like to mention a little bit a word about Corona. The pandemic is still with us. We still need to navigate how we interact with each other. We need to take care of each other, and we are following strictly official health regulation from the Danish government. So that puts a limit as to the number of people in this room, but it also should be a reminder to all of you not to group together, keep a safe distance, and use both coffee and tea areas when we have our coffee breaks at the end of both ends of this room. Having said that, Rasmus Prehn, I would love to introduce you to the floor, and please take the floor and take us into your perspectives on this issue.
Thank you, Jarl, for the warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to be here today and to co-host this symposium with our partners from Worldwide Fund for Nature, and to see such a strong lineup of speakers from IUCN, UNEP, and the Velux Group. We are in the midst of a global climate change and a nature and biodiversity crisis. In just 50 years, the worldwide population of birds, fish, and mammals have been reduced with 68%. I'm afraid I've just before in the film said 60%, but unfortunately the number is on the rise. In Lake Chad, the water has shrunk by 90% since 1960s, directly affecting between 20 and 30 million people depend on its water resources. In Ethiopia, more than 500,000 people are internally displaced due to droughts and floods. Droughts and floods and similar climate-induced disasters increase the risk of conflicts, poverty, and hunger. They undermine human rights and are a growing cause of forced displacement. We cannot ignore these challenges. They call for international solidarity with the most vulnerable people, future generation, and our planet. And they call for smart, integrated solutions and rapid action. Here, nature can play a key role. It has potential to address multiple problems at the same time. Nature-based solutions are one of the best and cheapest ways to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis, avoid loss of biodiversity, limit conflicts, food insecurity, and to create new green jobs. Let me give you an example. When we plant mangrove forest in Kenya, we first of all protect the coastal communities from storms and floods. At the same time, the mangrove provides fishing areas which create jobs and food security. And because of mangrove forest absorb 5 times as much CO2 than any other tropical forest, it helps to mitigate CO2 emission and climate change. The idea to look at the link between nature and development is not new at all. Already in 1987, the Gro Harlem Brundtland report, Our Common Future, coined the concept of sustainable development and started. The environment is where we live, and development is what we all do to attempting to improve our lot within that abode. The two are inseparable. So this is not new, but it is now more acute than ever. The COVID-19 crisis has made existing problems even more severe. We are faced with a global economic crisis and have seen an increase in poverty for the first time in 20 years. However, I believe our current situation opens a window of opportunity. An opportunity for us to build back better and greener. We need to see the solutions in the problems instead of the problems in the solutions, and to solve the problems through an integrated approach. Denmark must play a key role in this. Denmark has a clear ambition of global green leadership, and it is a priority to make our development cooperation greener across the board. We are not afraid to try our hand at new and innovative solutions, because we need to be innovative, and we need to look at all tools available to find solutions to the challenges. We believe nature-based solutions hold great potential as an innovative, cheap, and effective tool. To succeed with all this, we need strong partnerships with civil society and multilateral organizations. But we also need the private sector and the pension fund to ensure finance and real scalable impact. We are at a place and time in history where there is momentum and need for action. Next year, in 2021, we have the conference of all the Rio Convention on biodiversity, desertification, and climate change. All three conventions are interconnected, and in order to ensure real sustainable development, we need to work on creating synergies between them and find integrated solutions. I hope this symposium will inspire us to look to nature as a possible solution to the world's biggest crisis. Let us work together with nature, in respect of nature, instead of working at the expense of nature. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. And I was very excited to understand now how the sound would be. Hopefully it's better. But there was wonderful messages coming from you. And I think a great inspiration to how we can take this discussion forward this afternoon. I forgot to say also in relation to our audience abroad and virtual space that there are definitely opportunities to also ask questions to the panelists that we're going to have on the floor in a few minutes. You can do that through the WWF Facebook page where you can post your questions, and then we have a curator, which is Trina, sitting down here at the end of the table, who will translate some of those questions back to the panelists as we move forward. I should also say before we continue that just a word about myself. I'm the international director at a climate think tank called Concito here in Copenhagen. I'm also the vice chair in the Danish Council for Development Policy, and we are actually in that council responsible for advising the Minister for Development on the development of development policies. So there are definitely opportunities here to channel messages into the further development of the development policies of this government. So please take advantage of that and share all your best messages and advice to the minister as we move forward in this dialogue. Next, it's my great pleasure to invite Tim Christoffersen to take the floor, who is heading up the work in UNEP in exactly this agenda. And Tim has been working also at the CBD before and the IUCN before joining UNEP working on this issue. So welcome back to Copenhagen, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jarl, and hello everybody, both here and virtually. Thanks to WWF and the Foreign Ministry for organizing this very timely event. I think we just heard a strong endorsement from the Minister for this agenda, which is quite exciting. Seems to be this micro. Is it this micro I'm using? Okay. So I'll stay here. It's great to see that strong endorsement from the Minister for this important agenda, and at UNEP we're, of course, very much aligned with this, and I just want to take us into a little bit of a deep dive of what nature-based solutions are. We have prepared, together with Stuart McGuinness from IUCN, who'll speak later, a package of introducing nature-based solutions and what they can do. If I could have the next slide, please. So briefly, if you look at the definition, there are a few key words here that we need to unpack in the context of the Sustainable Development Agenda. The key word I especially want to draw your attention to is societal challenges. And every time you open the newspaper nowadays, it's full of societal challenges, as Bo and also the Minister said. Also, nature-based solutions have to provide human well-being and biodiversity benefits. That is essential. Nature-based solutions are not geoengineering that can be harmful to biodiversity, and it's an important definition that IUCN has come out with. They're also coming out with the global standard on nature-based solution that Stuart will introduce, so I will not go into detail there. I can have the next slide, please. But what has the Sustainable Development Agenda really done to all of our work? It's something that is still playing out, but what we see is that we all used to work in the biodiversity agenda, in the humanitarian, in the peace, in the climate agenda. All these agendas are now converging, and that is very exciting, and it's high time. There is no longer such a thing as only the biodiversity agenda, or only the peace or the health agenda. And at the bottom of the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, is a healthy biosphere, healthy fisheries, intact ecosystems to produce our water and food. A stable climate that allows us to have gender equality, to have peace, to have stability. So investing in nature-based solutions is investing in the foundations of sustainable development. Next slide, please. Climate has received the biggest attention, I think, of all the SDGs in terms of nature-based solutions. And what is the potential of NBS for climate mitigation in this context? This is from the UNEP emissions gap report in 2017, where we had a special chapter on nature. So you can say roughly 1/3 of the mitigation potential lies in nature. This is without the oceans, though, so we'll have another deep dive into the ocean potential. But what is important is that something special about nature and the role in climate mitigation. You cannot only have nature-based solutions without strong mitigation in the other sectors. Because if we let the climate warm too much, forests will burn, wetlands will dry up, and all the carbon that is locked up in peatlands and the carbon stores will be no use. So we cannot have nature-based excuses. This is very important in the context of which industries invest in and how in nature-based solutions. Next, please. We've already heard about the multiple benefits of nature-based solutions, ranging from water and food security, energy security, to jobs and livelihoods. The next, please. What I would like to focus in, next slide, please, a little bit on is, of course, COVID-19. The majority of all zoonotic diseases come from areas that are degrading, forests that are degraded. Forest deforestation and forest degradation can accelerate the spread of malaria and other vector-borne diseases. This concept of One Health, that human health and planetary health is linked, has now received a lot of recognition in the course of COVID-19, but this of course goes beyond the role of nature in planetary health. It goes to the role of nature in a green recovery. I can have the next slide, please. So in UNEP we run a number of adaptation, forests, restoration, oceans and food platforms for nature-based solutions. Next slide. And forests, and especially trees, are a little bit the rock star amongst nature-based solutions at the moment. Everybody loves trees and forests. And that's also for good reason, because they have the largest mitigation and also very large adaptation potential when you look at the climate solution. Here we work mostly with the UN RED program that helps about 65 developing countries to better conserve, sustainably manage and restore their forests. Next slide. The topic I would like to focus in on a bit more is restoration, because conservation alone is no longer enough. There's just been a really new paper in Nature released today, and also the Global Biodiversity Outlook is coming out next week, the Living Planet report. They all say the same thing. It's no longer enough just to stop the bleeding. We have to actively invest in restoration as well. And here we are fortunate enough that the General Assembly of the UN has decided to make 2021 to 2030 the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. All member states, even the ones that normally don't really agree on many things, have agreed on that. So that's a very powerful platform. That decade will start in a few months from now. The benefits of restoration can be huge. This is the Bonn Challenge of 350 million hectares of degraded land. If we restore that, about the size of India, we could generate $9 trillion in net benefits in ecosystem services. Next slide. So this is a sneak preview of the logo of the UN Decade that will be released in 4 days from now, so you're amongst the first people to see it. Everybody will be able to partner and link to this United Nations Decade. We're building a broad global movement to build more political will and build more capacity for restoration. We have about 400 organizations already lined up who want to partner, but as many as possible are welcome. So please join us also next Tuesday. There's a webinar for an Ask Me Anything option for potential partners who want to join the UN Decade. The official launch will be at the UN Environment Assembly in early 2021. Next slide, please. Just in a nutshell, this is the strategy of the UN decade. We want to accelerate the global restoration movement that is already emerging, finance restoration on the ground by coordinating multiple investors like the Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund, but also increasingly the private sector that has pledged a lot of funding now for nature-based solutions. But for that, we also have to set the right public incentives. We're still putting too much public money into fossil fuel subsidies and into agriculture subsidies that are harmful for biodiversity. Repurposing some of that money would unlock it could unlock several hundred billions of funding per year. At the moment, much of the money is spent on further degrading the environment, unfortunately. Celebrate leadership, shift norms and behaviors, including food and diet, invest in research, building capacity, and inspire a culture of restoration, and build up the next generation, and listen and learn. Next slide, please. We also work closely on adaptation with a platform on climate change adaptation and nature-based solutions. So in our Adapt with Nature platform, we would like to ensure that at least 500 million people are more resilient to climate change by adapting with nature by 2030. The minister mentioned the example of mangroves. We've done a survey of all the cost-benefit analysis of mangrove investments. So in a nutshell, you can get about between $9 and $10 in return for every dollar invested in mangrove restoration in ecosystem services. Next, please. So coming towards the conclusion, nature-based solutions is a broad concept, but it doesn't replace other existing concepts. This is also very important for us working in this space for many years or decades. It does not replace the ecosystem approach or ecosystem-based adaptation or all these other terms, sustainable forest management, that we've spent a lot of years developing and honing. It is an umbrella approach that makes sense in the context of sustainable development. It brings all of these approaches under one common approach that is solutions-oriented. Next slide, please. We have a lot of political momentum that is still building out of the Climate Action Summit in 2019. We are carrying that momentum forward as UNEP and with many other partners. Next slide, please. We also have, as the minister also said, we have a lot of important meetings coming up next year. In a sense, the super year for nature that was supposed to happen this year got an extension into 2021. And importantly, here, all the 3 Rio Convention COPs are next year, and they all have now a very large focus on nature, with REDD+ in the Climate Convention, sustainable land management, and of course the new biodiversity framework that we expect from the CBD. Next. So thank you very much. Join the Generation Restoration, our slogan for the UN decade, and look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Please stay on the floor, because please stay here for just a couple of minutes. There may be a question that we want to take from the audience to your presentation. Both here in the room, if there's a question on clarification or something you want to have answered now, you have the opportunity. That might also be from our virtual room. No? Okay, perfect. Actually, I wanted to ask you a question right away, which is building back better and greener. And we have this opportunity now to actually accelerate some of these, accelerate the use of the toolbox. Are you already now seeing such opportunities are actually being put forward by countries? I mean, are we seeing it being applied already because of the COVID-19 need to opportunity to build back in a different way?
Not as much as we would like, but we're seeing it in a number of developing countries, such as India, Pakistan, Rwanda, Nepal. There's many examples where we see green recovery investments, both domestic and foreign assistance, be invested in nature, in particular. Thank you. in particular in restoration, and we would like to see the same also, of course, in developed countries. So also for the EU with the new biodiversity strategy, with the farm to fork strategy, there is work coming up that can also happen at the EU level for more investments in restoration, because also the agricultural landscapes here are in need for, of restoration investments. And we're working now with finance ministers and the World Bank to also look at future fiscal policies and incentives to have this not be a very quick flash in the pan of recovery funds, but a long-term repurposing and rechanneling of fiscal incentives into nature-based solutions.
Thank you very much. And stick around. We know we're going to be in the panel, and there will be opportunities to ask more questions to Tim as we come to the panel discussion. Before we go to Stuart and listening into what the IUCN has actually been developing and putting on the table in terms of developing a standard for the nature-based solutions, we were supposed to do a small and quick poll, and we just need to get that there, which is basically would require that you actually use your cell phones. And you can do that both here in the room, and you could do it everywhere where you sit around the globe and take part in this poll. We are going to get an impression on what kind of words are actually the most important when people, you, the listeners, think and talk about nature-based solutions in terms of the challenges. So if you go to the website menti.com, and when you come to that page, you enter a code which is very difficult to see from here. There we are. You push the code 3161219. Then you are given the option of putting in words that you would associate with responding to this question. What are the biggest nature-related challenges facing your work, business, or mission? We'll leave you a couple of minutes to reply to that. And we now see the words start coming in. Those that get the most hits comes forward as the biggest word, so to speak, the biggest font. And I think it's fair to say that we are reaching very much a, not consensus, but a strong preference for the challenges, of recognizing the challenges related to deforestation, which is also at the center of many of the phenomena we otherwise see up here, impacted by climate change, causing biodiversity loss, etc., result of population growth. Just recognizing the fact that now when we are standing here at these thresholds, we're also looking into a future where we will add between 2 and 3 billion people to the middle class that will want to have exactly the same lifestyles that we are facing with now. Just calls for us to simply build new models for how we build and grow our economies. So deforestation, climate change, drought, unsustainable agriculture, biodiversity loss. I notice also lack of political will is coming up. The need for inclusion. We need a mainstreaming all of these issues into our decisions. Lack of funding, political leadership, and it's our consumption patterns. I think we end here, but this provides us with a good impression on the interconnectedness between an enormous amount of themes and challenges that really calls for us when we look into the solution space. We need to find synergies among these issues as we move forward. Yeah, and Stuart, we are back to you. Sorry about the delay. Stuart, are you with me? Can you hear me? Yes, Stuart, can you hear me? While Stuart moves to the screen, let me introduce Stuart. Stuart is the director for the natural.
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, yes, absolutely perfect. I was just in the process now of introducing you because you are from the side of the IUCN, actually putting a very specific concept or standard on the table, and we look very much forward to hearing what you have to say on this agenda. Please go ahead. Thank you, Stuart.
Okay, so thanks very much. I'm just getting my screen shared. Can everybody see my screen? Is that coming through?
It is indeed.
Okay. So everybody. So sorry. Just can you see my screen?
Yes, we do. We can see your screen.
Okay.
And we have everything.
Okay.
Just go ahead.
So thanks very much, Jarl, and thanks to the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and WWF Denmark in organising this. Again, as I think several have said, it's very, very timely. Also, thanks for Tim for a great scene setter, and I will try and avoid not repeating what Tim said because I think he's made a very strong case of why nature-based solutions are relevant and what they can deliver. I'm going to actually look at the now how we move forward, how we operationalise that, and precisely sort of some of the rationale why IUCN worked on launching a global standard earlier this year. In order to do so, I think it's important to maybe understand a little bit of the historical development of nature-based solutions. It's of course, nature-based solutions are on the tip of everyone's tongue at the minute. That's very gratifying, but there's really at least 20 years of work behind the current modern concept of nature-based solutions. And as I say, IUCN has been working with several partners, and indeed IUCN and WWF were really moved ahead with one of the early nature-based solutions, forest landscape restoration, way back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But we've really been building on a lot of learning. And the reason why I flagged this up, this 20-year trajectory, is in parallel with that, there has been a challenge, I would say, in the conservation community to really demonstrate the development relevance of biodiversity and the maintenance of biodiversity. And that started, I think, there was a good platform established in the early 2000s with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. But at the same stage, we really have been sort of working through and trying to define what is that, and what is that distinct contribution that nature makes to addressing these societal challenges that Tim highlighted as a key part of the definition. And what I would say is that where we've come up to now is actually an understanding where I would say we can now think of two pillars to our conservation work. One is what we're often very familiar with, the imperative to safeguard nature, to protect endangered species, to safeguard those habitats that are under threat. But using the same conservation norms and the same conservation science, we now actually can see how we can frame that understanding to helping safeguard society against several of these pressing challenges that emerge. They're rooted in the same philosophical basis, the same foundation, but they are distinct. And I think that is important to actually realize. It's taken us 20 years to really work that through and get, I think, this model in place. I want to emphasize what Tim said, is one does not replace the other. It is still an absolute imperative. We must safeguard and protect biodiversity and threatened species. But we also, at the same stage, I think now have got a new concept, a new construct in our armory that broadens the reach and broadens the relevance of conservation to a wider audience. With nature-based solutions, then, I think there's a couple of implications that we need to understand. As I said already, not all conservation actions are nature-based solutions, nor should they be. It is still important that we actually work to address direct threats to biodiversity for its own sake. But equally, then, I think very interestingly, that part of the emphasis from nature-based solutions is not on rarity values of biodiversity so much, but actually on the importance of biodiversity abundance. Think, for example, of a nature-based solution built around regenerative agriculture. There, what we need to see is not just a few rare nematodes returning, we need to see an abundance of soil biodiversity. So I think also that what's interesting with nature-based solutions is, again, it equips us with another pillar, another concept, and it also drives home this relevance that biodiversity needs to be seen not only for its rarity values, but for the importance of its abundance as well. Now, this I think is timely, because we've said this before. I won't dwell on this point, but just to make the point that if we looked at the global risk assessment, let's say 10 years ago, it would have been replete with economic risks. This time, for 2020, we can see it's dominated by environmental risks, and indeed some of the societal risks actually have ecosystem underpinnings as well, such as water crisis and infectious diseases. And so again, I just want to drive home this point that Tim has made and others have made, that the nature-based solution is this integrated approach, is the integrated contribution from the conservation world to addressing the SDGs. And Tim focused quite rightfully on climate change, because that is a major concern. But really and truly, I think when we look across the SDGs, we see the vast majority of SDGs have got a direct opportunity for applying nature-based solutions. And again, Tim has flagged that in some of the examples he gave. Now, all that is well and good. That's great. I think we understand the progress we've made. We understand the relevance of nature-based solutions. We understand that that gives us a new reach, new audiences, to folks who don't wake up in the morning maybe thinking about biodiversity. But if we are going to really make progress, if we're going to move this from a concept to something we can really apply on the ground, and that we want others who lining up to adopt and adapt, then I think we really need some precision. And this actually was flagged up in an editorial in Nature in early 2017. And it said, and it really highlighted this point that we really needed now to invest in understanding how nature-based solutions could be delivered. We needed to be evidence-driven. We needed to have a strong scientific and economic underpinning of that. And so really, this is where I would say IUCN sort of, I suppose, took this seriously. In fact, we had just launched the definition and definitional principles of the World Conservation Congress in late 2016. And so we said, actually, the challenge this editorial puts out is correct. So that's where we started to work on the standard. And just one illustration of why that is important. Even today, we still hear nature-based solutions being misinterpreted. I remember, actually, I mentioned the World Conservation Congress of 2016. I remember being in a rather strong, perhaps heated discussion with some colleagues who were saying, no, the ultimate nature-based solution is wind power and solar energy. Well, the truth is these are very admirable things. Of course, we want to see more of those, but that energy is derived from nature. It is not based in nature. The same discussion was around biomimicry, about taking inspiration from nature. Again, that's cool, that's great, we want to encourage that, but nature-based solutions, at the heart of nature-based solutions, lie in goods and services that come from a restoring or a healthy ecosystem. And that really defines what nature-based solutions are. So again, really sort of, I emphasize that point because if we are going to seize the opportunity of going to scale, we will need to be precise in what it can and cannot deliver and how it can be delivered. The other good thing, and this links very nicely with Tim highlighting the very exciting opportunity we're about to go into as a global community with the Great Ecosystem Restoration, is we already have a proof of concept out there. The Bond Challenge has shown that using forest landscape restoration, we really can go to scale. We can mobilize that range of actors that the minister referred to, the private sector, some investors, get governments aligned, and critically, as Tim highlighted, also start to reorient maybe some more negative subsidies, let's say subsidies just for single species plantations, to a broader set to incentive schemes for a wider range of options. And the Bond Challenge now has set off to achieve by 2020 150 million hectares of land under restoration. We currently have surpassed that now. We had an event last week with the German Ministry of Environment, which we're celebrating. We've now got 74 national and subnational pledges that total 210 million hectares. So really, really exceeding the initial 2020 milestone. We've also been doing actually quite a lot of assessment. We've assessed about a third of those pledges, so from 13 countries. And one of the really interesting things is those pledges are not just sitting on shelves, they are actually getting onto the ground. In fact, so much so that of the original 2020 milestone pledges, of the areas that we have assessed, the countries we have assessed, we can say that that has been exceeded by 15%. So 115% of what was pledged for 2020 in the countries we have assessed so far. As I say, I think it's clear proof of concept that MBS can be delivered at scale. And critically, I think there's a really nice synergy here, laying the groundwork with the UN ecosystem restoration. Of course, it's not just about pledges, and it's not just about getting trees or other ecosystems restored on the ground. It's about impacts. And one of the things we have been able to track through our assessment is in 5 pilot countries alone, we have identified 1/3 new jobs being created through the Bond Challenge. I want to link that back to the point that Tim made about the post-COVID agenda and building back better, because this will be important. Also, if we achieve the Bond Challenge's 2030 goal of 350 million hectares under restoration, we have the potential to sequester up to 15 billion tons of CO2 over a 20-year period. Now, very quickly, I want to go the last few minutes. I want to go to the framework for operationalizing MBS. We put in place a standard as a facilitative standard, so it doesn't put in place strict normative thresholds, but it rather is designed to help and encourage practitioners move forward, learn lessons, and improve. It is being developed and it's compatible with the ICO Alliance Code of Good Practice, and we've really sort of tried to make sure that it will be complementary to other verification systems. It's had 800 expert inputs, thousands of individual comments, and from a broad geographic base. And there's 8 criteria and 28 indicators, and I'll just very quickly just give you a feel of what those criteria are. The first one starts on absolute clarity about what societal challenges we're trying to achieve. There has to be precision on that. We need to know, is it climate? Is it land productivity? Is it disaster risk reduction? Or a mixture of several of those. The second is the importance, because we're talking about ecosystem and ecosystem functionality, there has to be a spatial component that has to be designed with a spatial consideration in mind. The next 3 really look at the pillars of sustainable development, that it's economically feasible, that there is a biodiversity net gain. And I'll emphasize that biodiversity net gain, not just do no harm, but we want to see an improvement in biodiversity. That is because the system itself relies on biodiversity, and inclusive governance and benefit sharing. There will be trade-offs, so we need to make sure that those trade-offs are balanced in an equitable manner. It is over the long term, so we need to see adaptive management and systems and mechanisms and provisions for adaptive management. And finally, ways of making sure that it is mainstreamed and that the longer term sustainability of the NBS is viable. There's a whole range of resources. I'm sure the organisers will make this presentation available. So there's several URLs and different tools, different approaches. But I just want to finish off by talking about how we measure on this, because we've actually done quite a lot of work now on measuring progress on the standard. And again, it is facilitative, so we indicate it across a scale from strong to insufficient, and realizing that many nature-based solutions may have and may want to have areas for improvement. I'm going to just give you one example. Let's say there's 28 indicators, but we give specific guidance on what we're looking for each indicator, and then we give a guidance on what is required for that to be considered a strong response, inadequate response, partial, insufficient. This one is on an indicator on evidence base for biodiversity. And really, as I said, the only threshold there really is that in order to be considered adhering to the IUCN Global Standard in Nature-Based Solutions, each criterion must have at least partially address the indicators. If an indicator set for one criterion is left unaddressed, then we can say, well, in that case, there's work to be done that does not yet meet sort of the basic standard of a nature-based solution. Very quickly, just to wrap up, we're putting a governance structure in place. One thing, anybody, I'll focus just on this user group. Basically, the user group's open to anyone. If you want to use the standard, if you want to apply it either in research, policy, or on the ground delivery, please contact us and join the user group, because that's going to be a community of practice we set up. So we're also going to have a strong input from science, so that we are really following and revising the standard periodically on the best science. And then the idea is to put in place a number of regional and national hubs that can really help build capacity and technical learning on the ground, as well as being able to give advice and feedback to the International Standards Committee and questions about how it can be adapted to specific local conditions. The standard and rolling out the standard is only one part of the work we need to do. As mentioned already, we're putting in place what hopefully will be a good, robust, and very transparent and accessible governance and oversight system. We are going to move forward. I had initially thought that when it comes to issues of assurance and claim, we could sort of think about that in 3 or 4 years' time. Just the feedback we've had from the private sector and from others alone means that we're going to have to accelerate that. So we're already putting in place a piece of work now to look at how we might approach assurance. One of the things, there's 2 things we don't want to do. We don't want to increase the transaction costs, and we don't want to compete with the many, many very good certification systems out there already. But we want to find a way of how you can actually say, yes, giving some sort of sign of assurance that this does indeed comply with nature-based solutions. And finally, we really need to look at the impacts. And the one thing I will mention here is that we really do need, one of the things we need to build the economic case for nature-based solutions. There's much more work needed. Final slide is, which I think is really interesting. I want to reinforce the point Tim made. This is really giving us a lot of interest. I have spent a lot of time actually talking to investor groups over the last couple of months. I will say this is still early days. It has been a bit of a challenge for the conservation community of how we look at innovative finance. But I will just flag up that for IUCN alone, we have got 3 initiatives in the pipeline. We've got a small one already underway, and we've got 3 initiatives in the pipeline. The total capitalization value of about 1.3, 1.5 billion. One is looking at supporting a early pipeline development. Then we're working with Pegasus Capital, the gold standard in R20 on a subnational climate fund, and then with the climate fund managers, we are looking at an investment that brings nature-based solutions squarely into the sphere of water and sanitation projects. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank Thank you very much, Stuart. Can I ask you one question following this very rich presentation, which also in many ways indicates the complexity in terms of addressing or caretaking nature-based solutions when taking it into policy frameworks. We need scale, and it needs to move fast. And now we have the framework and a toolbox. But what I found also very intriguing was the bond challenge. You know, that's a pure example of success when also taken to scale. If you are to single out one or two reasons why you succeeded in actually pushing the bond challenge to success, what is it that we can take on from that experience into other action arenas here?
Okay, thanks. That's a super question. I just want to check. Can you hear me? Is the sound still good?
Yes, you're fine.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks. I think that's a really super question, and I would say, perhaps not surprisingly, given the point that we've heard several times, Tim and myself have reinforced this point already. I worked very, very closely with the Bond Challenge. I helped set it up and moved it forward, and actually helped get some work up and going on the ground. And I think one of the things one of the real sort of secrets of the Bond Challenge was that when we went and we were invited into a country or at a subnational level, we said that the initial question wasn't, here's the global agenda, how do you, country X or Y, comply with it? It was saying, what are your immediate challenges? What are your sustainable development challenges? What is, I remember being in the minister's office in Kigali in Rwanda, and we said, let's put aside these global issues for a minute. What's in Vision, in Rwanda's Vision 2020 and Vision 2030? What are those key priorities that we know ecosystems can contribute to? Let us focus on those, and then by doing that, we'll be able to link those back to then Rwanda's contribution to climate change, biodiversity, etc. So I think, I would say one of the key measures of success with the Bond Challenge is that it has been demand responsive to national and subnational sustainable development needs.
Right, and that can be basically translated into if there is a sense of a local burning platform, then you can get the political leadership that you will require. So it's all about, finding ways to rise political leaderships in areas where we need to act. Let me just ask in the audience if there are any questions to Stuart, either here in the room or virtually and actually, while you are thinking about it here in the room, we do have from Trine a question that has come in through our virtual platform. If anyone else have questions and comments, please go to the WWF Facebook page where you can post these kind of questions. Please, Trine.
Yeah, thank you, Jarl. We actually have 3 questions from around the world. One is from Denmark, one is, I don't know, and one is from Myanmar. So let me maybe just start with the one from Myanmar, which is actually a colleague from WWF. He's asking, how has this standard actually been received by governments and development agencies, just to get a sense of how it's being picked up? That's one question. We have a question from Olga Baigus, who's asking, when the NBS is to be rolled out, how can we make sure they will actually be used? So maybe that's more broadly speaking, how will this standard be picked up and really be put into action? And thirdly, we have a question from Hans-Peter Dejgaard here in Denmark, who's noting that we know from climate adaptation finance that it's very challenging to actually mobilize sufficient financing. So how do you see potential business cases for investments in NBS? Can it be done at scale? Thanks, from Peter.
Please go ahead, Stuart.
Okay. Thanks very much, Trina. Those are all 3 very excellent questions. I'll be quick, actually, just to respect the time, but I'm very happy to follow up with more detailed responses at a later date. How is the standard being received by governments and development agencies? Well, one thing I can say is that we have we ran a Pacific a seminar for development agencies, government bilateral development agencies 2 weeks ago. We had 50 participants. We have been working very closely with several of them, and I think there's real interest in it. They feel that even as it stands at the minute, it may offer actually quite a good filter as they look to improve the integration of biodiversity into development aid, that provides that the MBS standard can actually provide a good screening tool. So we're working on that. But I say we've also then got, I've actually just seconded a senior staff member to work with the UK high-level envoy in preparation of the Glasgow COP. And I've got to say that it's given us quite a lot of interaction with the UK different departments there. And right up to ministerial level, there has been a real recognition and interest in the standard. So I think we're and of course on nature-based solutions more broadly. So I think we're in pretty good shape at this stage. Of course, I think that segues nicely into the second question of how do we make sure it's used. And I think that all falls on all of us. Nature-based solutions does not belong to IUCN or UNEP or a small group of us. It belongs to the world. It actually, although we've described it over the last 20 years, there's a long history that goes back centuries. And I think it'll be up to all of us to be able to drive that forward. We've got clarity on the definition. We've got a framework for how we can move forward on that. And I think there's a lot of interest. So I think it is, I would basically say it's up to all of us, and hopefully some of the tools that we put in place, IUCN with the standard and with the user group, UNEP being able to champion that platform for the decade on ecosystem restoration, we'll be able to bring and build communities of practice to work on that. But I think it's everybody's responsibility. If we believe in this and think it has got merit and think that it's helped us to move forward on bottlenecks over the last couple of decades, and I think it's all of us to move forward on that. I hope that's answered this question. And then the final question is the challenge of building the business case, and we know with the investment sector. I think one of the three the funds that we are working with at the minute, all of them do not try to push nature-based solutions by itself. And I think this is one of the real advantages of nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions come as an add-on to other solutions as well. Again, it reinforces, it goes to the heart of this idea of integration. So we still need good water treatment plants, but nature-based solutions can actually help manage through, let's say, upstream management, the amount of treatment that is actually needed. So I think one of the options is making sure that it complements to a significant degree other investments. And as I said, one of the things we all will need to do, and hopefully there's some researchers in the audience who are willing to take this up, I do think we need to put a bit more attention in really building a robust economic case. I believe the economic case is there, but I think we need to have it documented. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stuart. And I think also the entire discourse around natural capital accounting and the way that we can actually put value to some of these ecosystem services is a toolbox that is getting a lot of traction this year and will be really, really decisive in advancing the argument for why we just need to use the natural based solutions framework. So having said that, let me thank you for your participation in this discussion. Very much appreciated. And we will now move on to Melissa de Kock from the WWF, who has actually for many, many years been working on the ground in Africa in trying to align some of these challenges. You are a specialist with the WWF exactly on climate and community and nature, balancing these issues. So please, Melissa, welcome to the show and take the floor. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all to our previous speakers for the very useful information. So, as mentioned, I work in Southern and East Africa on nature-based solutions. And I will be speaking a bit about how WWF is engaging with nature-based solutions with a specific focus on this area. I'm just waiting for my slides to load. There we go. I'm working on the assumption that everybody can hear me, so I'm just going to proceed until stopped. Thank you very much. So I think both Stuart and Tim highlighted this particular graphic. But what I really want to say is that increasingly it's becoming very clear that nature underpins human well-being. And this is really it provides us with a lot of opportunities to work on this from that perspective. I'm not going to go into the details of the IUCN definition, which has been touched upon, but what I want to highlight is that for WWF, of course, while ecosystem degradation has been highlighted as the 7th societal challenge that NBS should address, we, of course, will address that as part and parcel of other societal challenges. It won't be the primary societal challenge that we work on, but rather a co-benefit. So some of the opportunities we see. Nature-based solutions present a very good opportunity to address both or all three of the issues around social, climate, and nature benefits synergistically. It provides opportunities for more resilient infrastructure and development pathways. It can be a very cost-effective alternative or complementary with grey infrastructure, particularly around issues such as disaster risk reduction, adaptation, and water. As mentioned already, it provides a very good opportunity to develop a fairer, greener, and smarter post-COVID recovery trajectory. By using nature-based solutions, we have an opportunity to really not only address existing health challenges, but prevent future pandemics. It has both application in rural and urban environments. It provides a very strong opportunity and something that we really want to highlight about supporting the needs and priorities of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Very importantly, it highlights nature's value as well as its potential for human development. So some of the elements of nature-based solutions, based very much on the IUCN definition, we need to contribute intentionally and directly to human well-being, and very importantly, at both a local and a global scale. We want to ensure maximum benefits to biodiversity. So this is about using nature sustainably and sustaining, enhancing, or supporting biodiversity while we're addressing societal challenges. We need to manage for change. Very importantly, if we're using nature to address climate change, whether it's adaptation or mitigation, we also need to be sure that that nature isn't being impacted negatively by climate change. We need to be context specific, needs to be appropriate for both the biodiversity in that area and, as mentioned, for IPLCs. Needs to be inclusive and implemented and designed with the full engagement and consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as other rights holders. As Stuart touched upon, there's a lot of complementarity with other solutions. We need to measure the impact. We've spoken previously about the need to be cost effective, but we also need to prove that nature-based solutions are an effective solution. As a result, we must measure the impact. We need to have a land and seascape perspective. While many nature-based solutions might be done at a local level, we really need to be thinking at the bigger perspective. And importantly, of course, NBS needs to be informed by science. So the design of nature-based solution interventions need to, as Stuart mentioned, we need to be very clear on what societal challenges we're addressing, and we need to be explicit about that. We then need to identify the targets of the intervention, the so-called beneficiaries. And again, both at the local level, but also at the global level. For us, it's not enough to say that a REDD+ initiative will benefit the world's population through mitigation. We need to be very sure that it also adds value to the people living with that forest. We then need to identify what nature will be used to address that problem. So what is the ecosystem that the nature-based solution is based on, for example, a forest? And what are the ecosystem services that will be used to deliver the benefits? Importantly, how will biodiversity and ecosystems be sustained or improved? And as touched upon, we need to monitor it very carefully to enable adaptive management. So how is WWF addressing nature-based solutions? So this is an evolving strategy. We have a steering group in WWF, we have a working group, and we are planning on developing a strategy. We've done a recent mapping of nature-based interventions in WWF. We've identified 120 or more of them spread around the world. We're doing quite a lot of work on policy and advocacy, trying to integrate nature into various sectoral policies, of course in the 2030 Agenda, the CBD, and the UNFCCC. Historically, a lot of our work on nature-based solutions has been framed around climate and freshwater, but there is the recognition that this is much broader. And also we have a bankable nature solutions program at WWF, which is about mobilizing private sector investment. Of course, this isn't identical to nature-based solutions, but there are a lot of overlaps here. So I'm now going to highlight a couple of the interventions that WWF is working on. From a policy perspective, while not a nature-based solution in itself, the policy perspective is very important to create that enabling environment. So we've been doing a lot of advocacy around how nature is very, very important for development, including how to integrate NBS into the revised NDCs. We're also looking at financing interventions. We've done some really great work in Kenya and Uganda around piloting of payment for ecosystem services in watershed management. I'm now going to go to 4 case studies, and I'd like to assure Stuart that I have screened them against the standard and do believe that they are quite robust nature-based solutions, but I welcome your feedback on it. In Kenya, we're working with integrated water and forest management around the Mau Forest and Mara River catchment. The Mau Forest is the headwater for the Mara River, providing water and livelihoods for thousands of people as well as for wildlife. Historically, however, there's been a lot of forest encroachment as well as unsustainable exploitation of the forest. This has resulted in deteriorating water quality as well as disruption of flow regimes to the basin. WWF worked with the government as well as local communities to create a shift to more participatory forest management, which has entailed benefit sharing, rights and access for rural people, restoring of degraded sites, and livelihood diversification in this area. What this has resulted in is increased water security, both for the people living in the river, but very importantly also for the downstream users, diversified livelihoods and improved yields for people, increased community resilience to climate and other environmental shocks, reduced erosion and siltation, flood protection, and climate mitigation. From a biodiversity point of view, this has resulted in a regeneration of the forest in those degraded sites and significantly fewer illegal activities. And very importantly, this has resulted in or enabled continued water flow to the Mara Basin, including the famed Masai Mara Reserve. If the water flow to the Mara River stops flowing to the Masai Mara, the very famous wildebeest migration is unlikely to happen. And there's so much tourism and thousands of jobs and millions of dollars that are dependent on that river. I'd also like to take you now to Namibia, where pre-1990, the local communities suffered from a great deal of disenfranchisement from the apartheid government. There were very few opportunities for income or livelihoods in these rural areas of Namibia. And there was a huge amount of commercial poaching. WWF supported the government and again, very importantly, the local communities to shift to a community-led sustainable management of wildlife and then later forests and fish. Now, the primary aim of this work was to improve livelihoods and well-being of rural Namibians. As a result of this work, since 1998, there's been increasing flow of funding to these rural people. There's now 86 communities that are established in Namibia, benefiting from wildlife management. And last year, they obtained 55 million Danish crowns to them from wildlife-based tourism. What's very important to note, however, is that this is not their only income. This is a complementary strategy to their traditional livelihoods. It's also enabled livelihood diversification, created additional jobs in an area where without wildlife-based tourism, there really aren't any other jobs. That funding is used for community development initiatives, which benefit all the people. There's also a number of socio-cultural benefits, which are incredibly important for people. This is about rights and empowerment and benefits and access. It's also resulted in increased fish catches in the community reserves that have been developed, as well as increased community resilience to climate and other related shocks. From a biodiversity point of view, this has created a vast network of additional wildlife-friendly area which has provided increased connectivity for wildlife to move. It's enabled significantly increased wildlife numbers in the country, as well as contributed to ecosystem resilience. Moving to the marine sector, this is a case study based around the Southwest Indian Ocean region. I think, as everybody recognized, ocean and coastal habitats provide many livelihoods, food security, and climate resilience in this area for millions of people. Traditionally, there's been a history of unsustainable use of these resources, resulting in degraded ecosystems, reducing livelihood opportunities, and there's been a number of climate change impacts for these coastal communities. WWF, again working with the government and communities, has supported the implementation of community-based mangrove and fisheries management programs, resulting in the restoration of mangroves, the protection of coral reefs, the diversifying of livelihoods, as well as conducting climate vulnerability assessments and developing adaptation options. This has resulted in increased food security for the people living in these areas. The fish are returning because of the mangroves, the coral reefs being protected. The crabs and shrimp also now have their habitat, which they can spawn in. Importantly, there's also increased income from new opportunities such as ecotourism, seaweed farming, and octopus sales. Importantly, this is also contributing to the adaptation and resilience of the communities. From a biodiversity point of view, the habitat is being restored, the fish stocks are able to grow, and the octopus are again growing to maturity. And also this has a huge impact for the resilience of the ecosystem. So a couple of reflections that some of which echo what both Stuart and Tim have mentioned. There are differing interpretations of nature-based solutions. And while we have the standard, which is going to play a huge role in assisting people to really identify the nature-based solution that they'd like to implement, it's also important to recognize that, for example, IUCN has an interpretation, different ministries have different interpretations, and the EU themselves has a different interpretation. Nature-based solutions are only one element of a strategy in many circumstances, often intertwined with policy as well as non-nature-based solutions options. As Stuart highlighted, and this is important for WWF, not all conservation is nature-based solutions, but all nature-based solutions should be based upon conservation principles. We find that it's incredibly important to manage the nature in nature-based solutions for change, be that climate change or the natural systems change, also very importantly, human-induced change, and also both over space and over time. It's also important to recognize the trade-offs. There's potential trade-offs between the global good versus the local impact, also the trade-offs potentially between climate versus nature. And lastly, it's very important that we take a long-term perspective on nature-based solutions. Thank you very much. Sorry, I wasn't able to hear that very well.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
can hear me now, right? Melissa, can you hear me now? Perfect, thank you. Let me just ask you one question. There's no doubt that it is you bring a new agenda to decision makers locally in governments, etc. Have you, over the last few years or the recent years, seen a further development in terms of appreciating the opportunities or the need to incorporate nature-based considerations in policy development? Is it being appreciated more?
I'm really sorry, but I'm struggling to hear.
All right. I think then we're just going to have to move on now. I'm sorry, but if we can't make the sound work, I think we should move on to the next speaker. Melissa, I have to thank you very much for your contribution. And then I think you left us with a lot of really good, rich thoughts for the further discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Instead, please allow me now to invite Ingrid Reimann to the floor. Ingrid is the Group VP for Global Affairs, Communications and External Relations and Sustainability. I can continue in many words for Velux. And you are actually bringing a fantastic story to the floor. You can, yes, you can speak from there, yes.
Maybe this one actually works.
Actually, I'm not sure, but.
Yes. This is okay? Yeah, this works. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I will share with you a case of partnership between, in this case, WWF, Denmark and International, and then the Velux group that I represent. We just launched last week a large commitment partnership, and of course for us in the Velux group it's our sustainability strategy going towards 2030 and even beyond towards 2041. And we've called it It's Our Nature. And of course this has this dual meaning that we believe that we as a company, it's part of our DNA to have a sustainable mindset and to work with products useful to society. We also are foundation and family owned, as some of you may know, and contribute to a lot of different sustainability projects, etc. But of course the other part of this meaning is the focus on the nature around us and the external world. So this is of course a communications way of trying to create some interest around what it is that we want to do. But I will, before I go into that, I will just spend 1 or 2 minutes on the building industry, which is where I've spent the last decade. And maybe, who has the clicker? Someone needs to click. There, yeah. So, and it's just to make the parallel for you, because of course within the building industry, we also have a lot of discussions around the green transition, sustainable development, etc. And one of the concepts that we are discussing a lot is also around, here I've said nature-based. We don't use exactly that word. We use either active building design, sustainable by design, biophilic design, or even biomimicry. But it's actually quite a close parallel. Because as you may know, buildings are important for the green transition. We spend around 40% of energy in buildings, 36% of CO2. Comes from buildings, and what is maybe not known to many people is that we actually spend 90% of our modern lives indoors. which is a quite depressing fact. But that is how we live our lives in, you could say, definitely, of course, the more developed part of the world. So looking just very briefly at buildings here on the left-hand side here, you can see two examples of buildings that are definitely not integrated with the surroundings, with the environment, which are definitely not active design. The first one is all these glass skyscrapers that you've seen a lot of. There's a lot of overheating cost. It's not very nice for human health, well-being, going back to your point also before. The second one, anyone who has been in China has seen, or other countries in Asia have seen examples as this, another example of bad building design, where you end up with the decentral air conditioning solutions, which are definitely not good for energy consumption or for what we call the embodied carbon, so the amount of carbon that are actually in the building. And then on the other hand, on the right-hand side here, this is what we call active design. And here you actually try to integrate the building with the forces of nature around you. So you use, of course, the passive solar heat, which is free to heat up your building. You use ventilation to cool down the building, use old methods just like the stack effect or skorstens effect in Danish. And with that, you don't need to integrate lots of technology in the same way and can reduce energy use and less embodied carbon. So I just thought it was an interesting parallel maybe to share with you to see with some of the discussions going in within our industry as well. But now moving on to our large commitment that we just launched here last week. So next slide, please. Yes. So we've launched Velux, our sustainability strategy, towards 2030. It consists of 15 targets. We've spent the last 2 years of going through all corners of the business, working, setting targets for waste, for biodiversity, for our workplace, safety, etc. But then what we have put here on the top of our strategy, what we call Pioneer Climate and Nature Action, that is the headline for our new commitment and partnership with WWF. So next slide. Yes, one more. So we've, over the past year and a half or so, had long discussions and talks with WWF, and we've ended up with co-creating or developing this new concept together. We've chosen to call it Lifetime Carbon Neutral, and we hope with this new concept to raise the bar for corporate action, and to maybe try to inspire other companies, maybe also other organizations, to think differently in terms of climate action and climate and nature action. So our commitment specifically is that we wish to become lifetime carbon neutral by our 100 years anniversary in 2041. And by doing this, we would take responsibility both for our future CO2 emissions, I'll get into that in a second, but also for our past CO2 emissions. So all the CO2 that we have emitted since we were founded as a company in 1941. So explaining what this is all about, and you will see that I will get to the nature-based solution concept, but I think it's very important for me just to spend a few minutes on what it is that we're going to do going forward. Also, because I believe it's extremely important for private companies when we enter into action like this, that we're not just, you could say, doing good and continuing business as usual, but really also making a sustainable transformation of our business. And that is, of course, the part that goes forward and goes into the future. So just a few words on it, what it is that we will do here, and that's the forward-looking part of our lifetime carbon neutral approach. So, next slide. Yes. We will follow the most ambitious reduction pathway set out in the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degree scenario that I'm sure all of you know. And of course, there's a lot of different actions that follow from that. Clicking one more time. We have signed up to the Science Based Target Initiative. At the moment, I believe there's in total around 900 companies in the world who have signed up to the overall science-based targets method. And of those, there's around 275, or we were number 275 in the world, who have signed up to the 1.5 degree scenario. So it's still a rather exclusive club. And of course, the reason for that is that it is complex for companies and requires significant effort and investments. So, and just to show the perspective of this now, I represent a manufacturing company. So we have a real physical product that we produce using raw materials, and we have our factories, transport, distribution, etc. And looking at how our carbon footprint is distributed, it is actually so that our own operations, what is also called scope 1 and 2, is actually for us only 6%. And the scope 3 part, so the whole value chain upstream and downstream, is 94%. And we believe that as a company, and as also the dialogue we've had with WWF, that going forward companies have to take action and have to take responsibility, not just for their own operations, which can be complex enough, but also really trying to impact the value chain. Because of course, if all actors in society do that, then we get a strong ripple effect and will hopefully much faster achieve the goals in the Paris Agreement. This picture is for us and for many other manufacturing companies is more or less the same. A general rule of thumb says 80-20 or 90-10, depending a little bit on the sector. So what we have set out to do in the future is to reduce the 6% completely, becoming completely carbon neutral, and then taking out 50% of the scope 3 part. So the value chain will be reduced by 50%, and that's of course where you see the sustainable transformation of the company, because that requires product innovation, it requires supplier dialogue, etc., and that is of course quite challenging. But then what we also have set out to do, and I think the development of this concept is really an example of SDG number 17, because we came up with it together with WWF. When we started our dialogue back over a year and a half ago, we talked, of course, about companies and what was important, biodiversity, climate change, etc. But then quite fast we started talking about what about the past? Don't we also, as a company, have a responsibility for the CO2 we have emitted, while we have, of course, earned money, created jobs, created growth, etc. So we've set out on this mission to capture our historical carbon footprint through forest conservation. So, clicking one more time. So, more precisely, what we have done is that we have calculated our historical carbon footprint based on production data. And we had our data verified by the Carbon Trust, just to be sure it wasn't just our own Velux calculations. And that in its entirety, including a safety buffer, amounts to 5.6 million tons CO2, that we will capture through forest projects from now until 2041. So it's quite a significant amount for those of you who follow the Danish dialogue or discussion towards our 2030, ambitious 2030 goal. This is around 10% of the yearly reduction that Denmark would have to do in its entirety. So it is actually quite a lot. And we've set out here with a 20-year-long partnership with WWF. WWF will develop in total a project portfolio of 5 different projects in different parts of the world. And here, of course, we rely completely on WWF expertise and knowledge from having been present for many years on the ground, but of course also the expertise of being part of international networks and UN dialogue, etc. The first 2 projects that we have scoped and are already starting is in Myanmar and Uganda. And then we are in the process of looking at where could the other projects be. But in total, we believe we will have around 5 spread in these areas. So, and of course, the focus here, and that's the whole purpose with our program, is of course to capture our historical carbon footprint. So working on carbon capture, but then of course what everyone talks about, and you know that more than anyone, is of course the hidden crisis, the biodiversity crisis. So we thought by choosing a carbon capture method, because of course there are other methods out there, technology or other fast-growing trees or algae, or there is of course different ways of doing that. But we thought by entering into a partnership that works with nature-based solutions, that we can really have several wins at the same time, for the climate, obviously, also for biodiversity, and of course for the local communities, the social livelihoods. And we believe that's, or we become very convinced that's the right way to do it. And it's also, we believe, the most sustainable way if you want to create, have a long-term effect. And then I know, of course, experts also know about water systems, etc. I'm not going to go there because I'm not an expert within this. But we believe this is definitely the way to go. And then one more slide, I think. This is just, I'm not going to go through this. For those of you who like numbers and would like to go through what is it actually that we've done and how, we have all the graphs and all the data, which is of course important as a private company to have legitimacy when you go out with a commitment. So it's all there. Clicking on to the next slide, we've also of course set up together with WWF a number of principles for how we're going to develop the projects and follow up, which is important for us, that we're also sharing, and will also be part of the method that we will share with other companies that we hope will follow suit. And I think here that there's of course a number of points. I think maybe the most important one is that this is not an offsetting maneuver. So it's not like because we're doing forest projects, then we will use those carbon credits to reduce our responsibility going forward. So this is not what it's about. As you saw before, we will follow the 1.5 degree scenario, and we will not claim the carbon credits and deduct them from our carbon calculations. And we believe that's important because, of course, companies can have a large impact if they work with historical CO2, but the whole sustainability transformation that we need as a society, that lies in the actions that company takes going forward. Yeah. So finally, we're sharing everything that we do on the webpage and of course Twitter, social media, etc. We hope to inspire others. We've actually already had the first email here this week from a company. I'm not going to name the name, of course, but the company which is Velox, which is in a different sector. Not a Danish one, but which is just out of the blue, or by having heard about this in the media, has written to us and say, hey, this is interesting, can we have a meeting with you and WWF to hear what that's all about? Because we're also looking at what would be the next for us in terms of our climate policy. So if that's the way it goes, of course, we're very hopeful. Okay, I'm just going to stop there. Is that, because I know we're a little bit over time, so yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. I'm not going to ask you questions because you're going to be in the panel and I'm eating into the coffee break. But I would just say, if only there were 1,000 Velux companies around, it would be great. Maybe not good for competition, but for environment, it would be fantastic. We are breaking now into a coffee break, and then we will be back here for a panel discussion 10 minutes to 3 o'clock. I should say, corona-wise, don't stand too close to each other at the coffee bars or in the doors. We actually do have a coffee bar in both areas outside this room. And then in the adjacent room, you're able to spread out and keep a safe distance. But please, thank you for your patience, and please be back here 10 minutes to 3 o'clock. That would be great. Thanks a lot. With us on the stage here, we also have Stefan Schuneman, who is the Undersecretary for Development Policy here at the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it will be very much Stefan, who has also been working for many years at the country level as an ambassador in Ethiopia, I remember, and been in and very much, you know, in your own hands and experience have seen some of the challenges we have with deteriorating environments. You will be the one that carry the messages from our discussions or from the panel's discussions into the ministry and to the minister, Rasmus himself. I'm going to hope that we will have an interactive dialogue where I will invite the panelists also to react to each other. Be sharp, brief, and to the point. As many rounds we can get, the better. I will ask the audience here, make use of this opportunity to dive into your own curiosity and get the answers that you need from these you know, decision makers that are, how should we say, have tried it out on the private sector side, where the policy side, the one that can take it forward in upgrading development strategies, etc. And then I would also invite you to take the floor as an audience. If you have questions, we have a mic here. Please come to the floor. And everybody out there across the globe, actually, that are listening into this event, do come forward with your questions on the Facebook, the WWF Facebook. Even the questions that we will not have an opportunity to answer in this room, you will get an answer later after the session has been closed. There will be people ready to comment on these questions. We will not go necessarily into the details of everything at this session, but now we're basically building, how we say, the stage from where we can further deepen our understanding on nature-based solutions. So, having said that, I should tell you also, I told someone this morning I was going to be here to facilitate a symposium around nature-based solution. And the person said, actually one working in the green startup, saying, the problem with environment is whenever you take part in environmental discussions, it's boring. But the thing is, this is not boring. This is actually the agenda of opportunity to resolve a lot of those complex challenges that we are facing in the years to come. So I will start off with you, Bo. You must be a very happy man.
Yes.
You have right now, you're part of a happy marriage, I should say, with Velux. You've done something like that with Carlsberg also. And you now have a toolbox on nature-based solutions. Is that what you need to move forward? Or do you still see barriers in terms of what you can use this for?
Well, we'll be looking for this for many, many years to have the foundation to go forward. You can do easy math and say we will never have enough finance and we will not have enough power to do this if we do not have the private sector with us and if we do not have this foundation for change. I think what is important right now is that we make sure that this toolbox is actually out there working, because we are running out of time. You mentioned it slightly, but we are really running out of time. So we can't afford 20 years like we did with the climate movement for this to happen. It needs to happen now. So we need to transform the toolboxes, the knowledge that we have, and then we need to start doing it very soon.
And if I move on actually to you, Tim, are you hopeful? You now have the toolbox. If you look at actions on the ground, how fast is it going?
I think in our field of work, optimism is mandatory. So yeah, I'm very hopeful. But recently, actually just in past weeks and months, even more so, because what we observe is that the private sector, local governments, and other actors are moving ahead, and sometimes ahead of the national governments. Of course, we would like to have strong national policies in place, and we need them. Without strong national policies, the private sector can and will not do much. But we see that the civil society, the private sector is moving ahead. And even through the COVID crisis, we did a survey of all the companies that considered these kinds of commitments. And 2/3 of them said, yes, we're still going ahead. 1/3 of them even said, yeah, we're still going ahead. We have made no savings to this commitment on climate change. So that makes me quite hopeful. And over the past few weeks, we have spoken with a number of private sector actors, new investment funds that are being put up by large financial players on forests, on agriculture, on nature-based solutions. So there's the emergence of a multi-billion-dollar restoration and conservation economy that we're seeing. And we have to be the ones to channel that in the right direction globally, collectively.
So you are a believer. You actually see a wave starting up now. You see from all sides of society an interest to actually make use of this understanding and insight that we finally have gotten. Bringing us to Velux, you are doing this. How does that fit into your business strategy? Not your philanthropic kind of thinking, I want to do good, but business-wise, is there a linkage?
I think, first of all, there's a very clear linkage with our DNA and our values. And I think that's important for any business, that if you want to act on climate change, you have to find the way that suits who you are, because that's where you have the most impact. And so I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. We are, of course, very convinced of what we're talking about here today, but for other businesses, there might be other ways of doing it. And we also, of course, respect that not every company is in the same privileged situation that we are, being foundation-owned, so it can be different. But apart from that, yes, of course, it also has a positive business impact. We haven't made any kind of return of investment calculations, because that is just fluffy numbers you can discuss. We've said we're going to spend in total on our whole strategy 1 billion Danish kroner. That's what we are ready to spend. And what comes back, how it comes back in terms of happy employees or better recruitment or customers who are more happy, innovation in our product development, creativity being unleashed. I don't know. We have not put any numbers on that because we don't think it makes sense. It's a question of we want to do the right thing, and then for the planet, but for ourselves, it's a question of trust and yeah.
It's very interesting because I think it's something that you hear more and more often from private sector actors. It's also an issue about being able to attract best talent into your company, that you actually have a clear position on wanting to make a difference, not only of socioeconomic issues, but also natural issues. Which brings us to you, Stefan. Classical development. This is not just about saving monkeys. There's something else to this. Why is that becoming relevant now? Why is that coming to the forefront at this stage, as you have seen it from working with development policy for many years?
No, sure. Thank you, Jarl. And I'll dive into answering your question, but I just need to appreciate this event a little bit, if you allow me. We started out with an extraordinary good video with Bo and our minister. And when you see an upbeat video, you think, okay, what's going to happen here? Is that the high point? It was a good video, but then what happened was that we got so many good speakers on the floor, and I'm impressed by the knowledge and the insights that has been discussed today. So this is extraordinary. And why is that? Why is it relevant? Is there a wave coming? I do believe, and I think facts, as mentioned, are speaking their clear language. For us, and you heard our minister, this is certainly something that we need to absorb and take on board. And having said that, and before making it a wave, let's also remember that it's not new. Working on these issues has been part of our DNA for many, many years. You were kind enough to mention some of my earlier working places, so to speak. But I was 4 years in Nepal many years ago, and there we had a program called NAMSAP, which is a forest user group trying to include super marginalized groups of society in a sustainable way of living and using the forest. In Ethiopia, where I was quite recently, they have a super ambitious plan to translate the agricultural sector into a machine in the economy, creating growth and so forth. It needed greening. We took part in that, creating much more sustainable solutions. So it's been there, but we need to do more. And how do we do that? We need to be systematic. We need to link up with our partners. Rasmus is on this agenda, part of a government with a clear ambition to step up green investments. And it's taking place. There's a strategy coming. Perhaps we can talk about that later. And the ambition is crystal clear. It's going to be even greener. So we have put more funding into key partners. Some are sitting here. We have partnerships with Bo and other very, very solid NGOs. So they are all part of the equation, but so is the private sector. And it's a super really, really inspiring story that we need to carry with us. But then again, there's been a lot of examples from the past. We are learning how do we do this more systematically? How do we scale it? I think you said, Tim, in your presentation, agendas are converging here. So working with this is also doing other things. It's also addressing other challenges. It's a concept, it's a tool that we need to bring in, and I think this is key. Stuart's presentation mentioned the Bonn projects, I think they're called, and had a figure of creating more than 300,000 jobs. And looking at development more broadly, jobs is key. So I think that's an interesting example. I spoke too long, but yeah.
No, extremely useful. The entire emphasis on working on greening development with a focus on exactly jobs and also as a counter to increased migration factors, etc. I mean, it all hangs together. The problem here now is time and scale, and barrier-wise. When we talk time and scale, what can we do? We have the framework. We know there are barriers. What can we do?
Yeah, so I'm guessing that this is a lot about how we think and how we go about projects like this. And that's why it's so interesting that there's a new strategy under development, because there we have the opportunity to set, you could say, the barriers, what would we like to support and invest in, and then all the different organizations and parties who have this knowledge, they know the framework, and we can bring ideas forward. I think one of the most important things that have happened the past few years is that earlier on there used to be this idea that there was a conflict between fighting poverty and saving nature. Now we've proven, we also have some projects which are funded by the Danish state. We have proven that these can go hand in hand and compete with other types of projects. There also used to be a conflict between short-term crises and long-term solutions that will prevent future crises. Now we know that we can create jobs by doing mangrove restoration, and then we will have more security on food and water and protection against floods and so on later on in the process. So I think all of these misconceptions, now we have proven that it doesn't need to be like that. You can do both. We will have a framework, and so I would like that we could have a committee or something, some body that could support this work, so that it will really be easy for those of us who are eager to get started to actually do it within the framework of all the other interests and political needs there may be.
Excellent. So you're specifically proposing that would be some kind of a platform or place or process or committee or whatever that would actually help accelerate that kind of thinking, advising what could be done in context of a new strategy. Is that
exactly? Because we've seen this working on climate and so on. Why not have a nature ambassador, for example, that has proven to work really well for climate? Have a committee that can support. Have an independent council that can advise. Let's do it now. Instead of talk about it in 10 years like we did in the climate situation, then we will have fewer problems later on.
I noted the word nature ambassador. That's interesting. One of the challenges that, I worked for a number of years at the World Bank, and one of the issues was always coupling finance with ambition and actions. How do you do that? Looking at the private sector, that's one arena. Another arena is finding ways to put value on these externalities get it inside, how should we say, the government's machinery way of thinking. We have learned it takes time. So the question is to you, Ingrid. You have now given an example of how it can be done. You are part of the Science-Based Target Coalition, etc. Are you planning to actually go out and do even more championing your example on what you have done? You just told that you've been called by another company that have showed interest, but this needs to be advertised broadly, globally. How can we do that? What would be the way forward, you would think?
But that's where obviously I think the private sector is extremely important in tackling the challenge of climate change and biodiversity, because it is in our nature as companies to communicate and market what we do. And if you want scale and if you want to convince people, you also have to be strong and explaining in very simple terms what it is you're doing, and not least the why. And that's what I think private companies, that is in the essence of being a private company, is of course having a customer relations and being able to explain the value of whatever you bring forward. And so I think that private companies can sometimes maybe in more simple terms, and maybe also to other audiences, that, you say ordinary people, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, come forward with the examples and explain the why, maybe in a more simple, sometimes also more compelling. And also, of course, if you have a strong brand, which is a trusted brand as a company, you already come with a legitimacy that people trust. So I'm very much a proponent of private sector stepping forward and being the voice. And of course, showing by example, and there can be different examples. Here we've got one, which we believe is the right way, and there can be other ways of going forward. So I'm really a proponent of that. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And UNEP, you're also working with finance. UNEP is also a body of your organization that actually works with investors and how to address also environmental issues. And I know that they're also working on some of these aspects as well. But I wanted to ask you another question, which is, in terms of the barriers, you said there are movements, we are on a wave that is starting. You need leaderships. We heard that from one of the interventions. If you have local ownership and leadership on a burning platform, then you can actually get the action at the scale and level that we want. How do you see ways in which Denmark could do a difference in that context? What could Denmark do to actually help you push this agenda concretely?
So Denmark, despite its relatively small size, has been an outsized player, I think, in the past already on a number of issues, going back many years, on renewable energy, on water. So it's doable if you choose very specific and targeted interventions that are strategic and have a multiplier effect. And that's perhaps again why the role of the private sector is so critical. For the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, we did a calculation of all the various cost estimates that are out there. What it really takes to restore ecosystems at a planetary scale by 2030, we came up with around about $1 trillion. So it's an amalgamation of different costs from different sources, but give or take a few billion, $1 trillion, it sounds like a lot, but between now and 2030, it's 0.1% of global domestic product. If we're not able or willing to invest that in our planetary home and in the basis of life, then maybe we don't really deserve to get out of this unscathed. So I think that kind of reinvestment, though, will not only be public money. It has to be a reprogramming of how the economy works. And therefore, it's fundamental that through bodies like the United Finance Initiative, we have about 230 members of all the pension funds and insurance companies and banks, that we trigger a shift in the way investments are made in the agri and food sector. Again, Denmark has some very large companies in the agri-food system. Denmark has some large players in the finance industry. That we shift and reprogram the way the economy works. And one other aspect that Denmark has already helped us do is to rewrite how a Minister of Finance actually knows if the country is doing well. Because right now, the Minister of Finance, most countries, they look at GDP, numbers of jobs, is a very limited number of indicators. And in the UN statistics, since a few years, you can actually now officially measure the environmental account as well. So what is your natural capital? Are you only doing well because you're drawing down on your forest resources, on your clean water? Is that why your GDP is going up? So that sounds like, it's a boring statistician's job to measure, but it's actually very important for the way nations know if they're doing well. So it's a combination of different things where we need to push and pull, and some are better at pushing and pulling some levers. But as long as we coordinate and work together amongst the different players, governments, the UN, NGOs, private sector, I think there's a real momentum that is emerging.
So what you're basically saying is Denmark is doing already what it should. I'm just gonna provoke you a little bit by asking you if there would be an ask for Denmark, and on top of all the excellent things that are already happening, what would it be?
Well, Denmark, I think, is well known for the water and renewable energy sector. To add nature to that would, I think, be what would be ideal at this point, because it can contribute to a lot of these agendas that we talked on today, and to say, yes, Denmark is making green investments now also priority of official development assistance would be great.
Yes, exactly. And at a point in time where we have climate change impacts deteriorating livelihoods locally, also in migrant producing areas, there's actually a lot of common interest in addressing this kind of issue in such a way. Well, the strategy itself, you haven't even started. It's coming, so it's too early to say anything actually really about the strategy. But I guess it is fair to say, Stephen, with this government and with Rasmus's kind of approach to greening development, it does provide an opportunity to bring, how should we say, balance between the three dimensions, and in accordance with the SDGs that we actually never have seen before. Does that pose an opportunity, you think, in terms of also partnering with new partners in civil society or business or investors, etc.?
Thank you, Jan. But I think you said it, Tim, in 2 words: add nature. It's unfortunate that we are at that point where we need to remind ourselves to add nature. That's why we're sitting here. But having said that, of course, moving forward with a strategy, having a government with a crystal clear ambition to move on these agendas, this is going to change things. Exactly how is way too early, as you say. But I think with the standards, with the experience on the table, with Tim being kind enough to remind us that we do have a critical mass of knowledge also here, I think it is going to change. It's going to be visible. But I think another key word is partnerships. I think the current strategy is already based on partnerships. it's going to be even more so, because it's crystal clear on this and on many other agendas that development assistance will not do the trick alone. We need to work in partnerships with private sector, with NGOs, and so forth. And I think our approach on this is going to be similar as on a number of other issues, that we'll continue to support key players like yourself, Tim, IOCN, so forth, work within UN system, other places where the big agenda is set, where overall direction is established. Now we have standards. And then we're moving down to the field and trying to create the good examples, again, with partners, and hopefully allow that to inspire. We're going to see that. And this is what Rasmus is talking about when he's talking about the little green wheel, or the little green gear moving a bigger system. Yeah.
Excellent, perfect. And among those partners, looking you, Ingrid, and then I'm just going to inspire the audience to think about a question to come up with while I talk to Ingrid. It also goes for you in the virtual space. Be ready. Ingrid, isn't it all, I mean, seen from the outside, as kind of it's a dilemma. Everybody talks about, the private sector. We can't do nothing without the private sector. We need private partners to address these issues. But the private sector is not at the table. And there are all kinds of suggestions. Should we reform the UN system, the governance system, bring them to the table, be part of the debate, part of the solutions? We're out there, we are in contact with society, etc. If there is a process around engaging you and building on your example, at what stage would you see you as a company being able to take part in that kind of dialogue? Is it as part of a committee like what Bo is suggesting? Would you be, as a private sector, would you see yourself being able to go into that kind of sounding board for a ministry that wants to develop a new development strategy, in theory, in principle?
Most definitely, we would like to share experiences and also maybe open maybe the eyes of what is important for a private company. And that's why I think it's extremely important following the partnership approach, because in the past year that we've been sitting together with WWF, I don't think that any of us would have arrived at where we are if we hadn't been together. So that goes without saying. We've both become more clever and have co-created in the process. And with regards to the UN negotiations and the COPs and all that, I've attended quite a few myself, but I've always had to, first of all, struggle to get a badge, as I'm sure some of you have tried. And then it's like, okay, Danish Confederation of Industries, they have 7. Okay, can we have 1? And then you find, of course, you're in the tent outside and trying to do some side events and all that. And of course, I know there's very good reasons for that, and not least that the private sector is not one sector. There's also some quite different, very, very strong private interests who are definitely not in favor of the discussions that we have here. So I respect that. But I've sometimes felt like, okay, we're very much on the outside. Can't we please come in and, show some examples and some solutions? And then if I just may add, what I think is also important for private companies when you enter into partnerships like this is, of course, that whatever climate change action, nature action you take, that you can be certain that you preserve the trust that you have spent maybe decades on building with your customers. Because that's what it's all about. If you lose the trust as a company, whether it is towards consumers or other businesses, then it takes years to build up, and you can lose very, very fast. So I think companies would be looking for climate and nature action where, of course, you maximize impact, like we see here, but also where you minimize risk. And that's why I think the nature-based solution approach is extremely interesting and relevant, because, of course, for a company, you cannot do good in one area, saying now we're doing something for the climate, but if at the same time you have creating troubles for the local communities or hindering development biodiversity, etc., of course, in the end, it's a question of you lose your trust. So I think it's both maximizing impact and the minimizing risk that is important for the private sector. And that's why we find this holistic approach extremely compelling.
Excellent, thank you. Can I then ask the audience if there's any questions? Please come to the microphone, and Trine, also be ready if we have hundreds of questions in the cyberspace. Please go ahead. Please tell me who you are or where you come from.
Thank you very much for this hugely inspiring event, and most of all, congratulations to WWF and WWF. I really think you've nailed it in terms of both dealing with the very difficult climate debt discussion, saying no to offsets, which I think is very brave, and also dealing with or promising drastic reductions in your future emissions. And maybe I would like you to reflect a little bit later on setting the bar so high. Do you think it's possible for the majority of companies to follow, to actually do something? I hope they will. And then I'd like to turn also to Stefan to a similar example of what I think has been one of the biggest Danish climate investments in history, where Denmark has supported countries in Latin America mainly, but like Bolivia, Peru, Nicaragua, in safeguarding huge forest areas with rights, territorial rights. And as WWF and WWF, they are fulfilling what IPCC and IPP's, the biodiversity ecosystem panel are saying is that if you want to, you need to do something fast with biodiversity and climate. The only thing you can really do very fast is protecting huge carbon-rich ecosystems like peatlands, but also tropical forests. What EPEX is also saying in their global assessment report using IUCN data is the most efficient way of doing it is through indigenous people's rights regimes. They cannot do it alone, they need support. And Denmark did that support during 10 years and have assisted in these 20 million hectares, which many of them are still there, but are under high pressure. So my question to Stefan is also to reflect a little bit on the huge forest fires, which we see also this year, achieved a lot of attention last year, but what can Denmark do, and what will Denmark do in this new strategy with relation to safeguarding indigenous people's rights? Thanks.
Yes, thank you for the question. No, I don't think all companies will be able to do the same. I think that can be difficult depending on what sector you're in. And I think there's several things that each company would have to consider. There's something around the ownership structure. Of course, in the end, there are owners as a board, but behind the board there are owners. And if the owners don't agree, then of course, and if they want the profit of the company paid out instead of going to 20-year-long partnership, then of course that's how it is. But that's maybe back to my previous point with I don't think that you can make a return of investment calculation on partnerships like this, and I don't think you should. But of course there might be some owners who would not accept that. Then of course there's also, depending on which industry you're in, if you're very high energy intensive, there's definitely, of course, if you've been dealing with a lot of raw materials, then of course you have emitted a lot more CO2, and at the same time, if you have very low margins, then of course it can be so costly that you just simply can't do it. So of course it takes some, it will be different from company to company. But what we're saying is not that every company should do the same, but just trying to inspire and make other companies reflect on what has happened in the past. So what is the footprint that you have left? And here we're talking about the carbon footprint, but it could maybe also be, I don't know, chemicals emitted or plastics, or it could be also within other areas. So trying to say it's not good enough just to draw a line in the sand and say from now on we will behave really well. Because we all know that after 2050 we have to become carbon negative, and for that we have to capture carbon from the atmosphere. So someone has to step forward and do something more.
Yes, yeah. And enabling a race to the top for those who can is quite okay. We shouldn't stop for that reason.
No, that's the leading by example, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. Stefan?
Good. Thank you, and thank you, Jakob, for an excellent question. You are asking what Denmark can do, and of course, then we are moving into what you know well is ultimate decisions made not by me, but our political masters and so forth. But I think the message from Rasmus is clear, and somehow I hope that I have indicated that I will certainly carry a message with me back on the issue of nature-based solutions. Specifically, you're referring to our previous engagement in forest in Latin America. And again, without making this a boring session on how development assistance develops, you also know, and many of you know, that this is something that develops over time. Priorities do change and so forth. But on the question whether indigenous people and forest is important to us, I need to say yes. You know, because we're supporting you. Bo knows, yeah. I think our good friends in Ugia knows well also. So could we do more? Yes, and that's the case for a number of agendas. But as I said, let's bring it on board in the process, in the dialogue that we are going to have on moving forward with the government that are dedicated on this. And let's see what happens, yeah?
Excellent, Stefan. Excellent. Trine, do you have a question? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Jarl. This is a question from Helene Gjerding, who is from the Danish umbrella network called 92 Group, and she's asking if any of the panelists can comment on the need for legislation, be it national or international or EU. Would it help, and what kind of legislation would be helpful? Thanks.
That's a small question. Okay, regulation-wise, we are in a decisive decade. Could we just get one of the panelists to maybe address what the opportunities are? Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking, I'm just saying, I'm thinking EU, Green Deal, I don't know.
Yeah. Could be a good idea, but we're in a hurry. I think I made that clear. Legislation does not work in a hurry. So let's just do the, I was almost swearing there thing and get it done, right? So we all have the same intentions. We now have the frameworks. Let's get it done. And a very brief comment on Jacob's question. You can't do conservation or do anything like this if it's not on the terms of the local people. So land and nature is a commodity, and there's a lot of people, and there's not much land left. So all these solutions have to be in concordance with the people who live locally. It cannot work any other way. We've tried that in the 80s and the 70s. It does not work. And I can say, Ingrid also knows this, that the projects that Velux are conducting with us are made in exactly the same manner. So that's simply how it must be done.
But there is an issue there, I think, if I may just add, because if you look at the country like Denmark, where we have had all kinds of protected areas, Nature 2000, Paragraph 3, or Wildlife Reserve, etc., no matter what we've called protected areas in Denmark, biodiversity is crashing. We have not come up with one piece of legislation that has actually had a positive impact on biodiversity. The same goes for most of the European countries. So there is a regulatory kind of an issue that we haven't understood. Maybe something that has to do with the fact that we don't know how to price these kind of externalities. So that being said, I think we move on to a question here in the room. We're going to close. Actually, we're running over time, and we are quite aware of it, so we're going to close very soon. But just I see 2 questions here in the room, and maybe we'll take one more from you, Trine. And make it brief and short, please.
Yeah, Esben Brandi, Future Force Company. I work with pension funds and investment managers developing sustainable and climate-oriented investment opportunities. My question is to the entire panel, and I don't think everybody needs to answer, but from the global south, you now hear quite a lot of criticism for nature-based solutions as a second wave of colonization, not providing proper jobs, no taxes, no pensions, no real opportunity for global south to actually develop their economies, their industries into something we have here. And I wanted to hear how you think and how you reflect on that in relation to nature-based solutions.
It's the old conditionality question. Who will... You want to take, Tim?
Yeah, thanks, Aspen, for that question. Just a quick word on the regulation. If I could make one wish for a piece of regulation, it would be on food imports into the EU and what footprint Denmark and other EU countries have. I had a meeting on this with the Ministry of Environment this morning, who are thinking what kind of role Denmark can play. So let's not forget Denmark also has a role to play within the EU, not only on foreign affairs and development assistance. On the question of the nature-based excuses, if I may call it that, because those are not nature-based solutions. You saw the definition, they have to contribute to human well-being. So anybody who has or designs something that deprives people of their fair share of benefits, that is not a nature-based solution. And we have decades of experience of how to do it right. This is not a new concept. This is just it is a more powerful brand. So we've turbocharged the brand, but the knowledge comes from decade of testing and trying, FPIC, free prior informed consent, INRAD plus, verification of the carbon measurements. We know how to do this, maybe not at the scale that we're talking about now, and there is a risk, so let's not downplay that, but maybe it is also time for us to say, and here, all my respect to WWF and other NGOs, but if we want to get this right, we have to see big nature investments on the scale of other big infrastructure investments. If you plan a new port or a 4-lane highway anywhere, there's dozens of engineers, there's hundreds of studies being done. These are definitely not nature-based solutions, and I wouldn't always agree with them, but they do that stuff right because the money is there to do it right. And this is the same with nature-based solutions. It has to be done right. It has to be done with the right kind of consultation, planning, different kinds of expertise you need on the ground, and it is time to pay the proper price for doing what such projects cost.
Just a small point to Tim's very solid reply there. But let me just say, that's not going to work. I mean, at least not when this is not how development aid is supposed to work. So besides the very clear answer there, of course we need to be careful and mindful if this is coming. But listen, ownership is key when you work in different partnerships and so forth, and we're going to continue to insist on that. But then I think it comes back to the issue of converging agendas here. This is not, and you're saying it, this is not a standalone thing. This is going to interlink with many other things, and there will need to secure sustainable development impact, of course. But there is a risk, I guess. We're all saying we need to move fast. There's no time for legislation. There are just go, go, go. Of course we need to be careful here, not to slip and be blind for all the many dynamics that's always involved in fast moving and upscaling.
Yeah, it requires perhaps a new scale or level of agility, of doing development differently, as we know when the ministry is also discussing a lot on how to do that. Tim, you had, but we have a very, very brief question, because then we have a question coming from the floor.
Everything you do must have some kind of funding. Most of the nature-based solutions we've seen so far has been funded by organizations or foundations who have conservation at the heart, and not necessarily the whole society as a part. That's why it's so interesting what Ingrid says. We see this as risk management. I see this as an opportunity, but we have a shared interest, because then you make sure you see this. The same goes with development aid. You have political aspects, you have partnership aspects, and so on. So the judgment of the projects we've seen so far, you have to see it through the lens of how they were created. I think what we're discussing here today is in another size, and will be better suited to make sure that all interests are met.
Excellent. Do you have a question? Brief.
I do. I'm going to try to be brief. My name is Leslie Snyder, and I'm the director of the Mental Health and Psychosocial Support Collaborative. We're hosted by Save the Children here in Denmark. And I know this may sound a bit unusual, but we actually have a climate change mental health researcher working with us from Johns Hopkins University. And I'm learning a lot. I learned a lot today, but we're studying the interface of mental health and psychosocial well-being among conflict-affected children and families and youth, and that bi-directional relationship. And I heard words here that really resonated with me, which was safeguarding nature, safeguarding societies. Well, this is what we're into, the safeguarding of children business and safeguarding of youth. And I also, several years ago, had the privilege to hear Kevin Bales speak about his book, Blood and Earth, I believe it's called, on human slavery and the interface with ecocide. And all of these things really resonate with me. I realize I'm speaking with more of development people here on the panel, but do you see the interface with the humanitarian world? And of course, what we have is the root causes of conflict, forced displacement, and migration. And also the effects of migration. Refugees, when they cross borders, when they land in camps, also have a huge footprint. So I'm wondering if you see that interface, and if you also see the possibility in terms of this building back better, a way that we can get the youth that we engage with around this issue involved with green jobs, because they have fabulous ideas. And I'll refer you to our website and our video where we interviewed youth from Southern and Eastern Africa, sort of to look at the ideas they came up with. But do you see the interface? I'm just finding it myself, but I'd love to hear from you.
It's a great question. Who would like to take that one?
I can make a brief comment. Yes, there's a very big interface, and that's why I mentioned earlier that these solutions can create jobs just like any other solution. Every 2 years or so, Danita evaluates the partners, how they're doing, and these green solutions, We Do Them Care and others, they perform pretty well, so they can be interlinked. And then you have to remember also the long-term perspective. If we do not do this, we will have more problems of that kind. So this is both a short-term and a long-term solution, perhaps also supporting humanitarian needs.
We're very involved with something called the Great Green Wall Initiative, which is building more resilience across the Sahel. And it started as a forest and landscape restoration initiative in 2007, but it has really evolved now to be more of a focus how to use land management to ensure equal rights and access, to ensure health and prosperity. So restoration of ecosystems has morphed more into a humanitarian and peace agenda there. It's quite an interesting project to study, a huge project. And so your question is super important. For the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, we did about 100 youth consultations that were all self-organized. So all these different events happened by youth who got together and brainstormed what they could do with this UN decade as ecopreneurs. So we didn't even have to organize it. So there's so much enthusiasm out there, and they sent us a report. This is what we want. Here's how we want to get this done. So absolutely, you're right. There's so much enthusiasm and potential out there. Thanks for raising that.
Okay, and very brief, Stefan.
I'll do super brief. Yeah, just to underline. When nature collapses and people are displaced, you're often faced with a humanitarian disaster that you need to address immediately. But the solution to improve the situation and to create stronger resilience is a development challenge. But the things are interconnected, and we see it as that, certainly.
Excellent. I'm noting nobody's leaving the room, and we're way over time, so we're just going to do one question from you, Trine, from the cyberspace, and then we're going to round up and close.
Yeah, thank you, Jarl. This is another question from Myanmar, and it's more of a development question, I guess. It goes to any of the panelists, but what do you see, what's the importance of least developed countries like Myanmar or Uganda, we've talked about earlier, for them to actually take action on the nature-based solutions, for them to prioritize it? And how do you see countries like those being supported in doing so? I think we've heard from Velux and WWF in supporting it, so maybe Stefan and Tim, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, I can take it. I'm sure Denmark and the ministry also has a lot to say on that. The role is, of course, one where we have countries with very little investment opportunities domestically and a very low responsibility for the for the carbon footprint. Low emissions, so there's not much for them in their nationally determined contributions under the Climate Convention to invest themselves. But what they can do is to create the enabling conditions for the kind of investments for these projects we've heard, or ODA, to flow and be effective on the ground. And Uganda is doing that a lot. 2 days ago, I looked at the NDC for Rwanda. There's a number of countries across Africa that have made nature-based solutions a big part of their climate response, and interestingly, often from an adaptation perspective. So what those countries can do is ensure there's the right, good rule of law, good governance, the right enabling conditions for these investments to flow. That is, I think, the biggest contribution they can make.
Perhaps just to add, the question is a strong case for long-term development assistance, because it's in that relation that we, at least as a government, establish a deeper understanding and a good relation with a partner country, and can work on many of the issues that Tim is rightly pointing to. But we need to realize what you're saying, that resources or capacity to do this is, of course, not always high, and we all have a task here to build up. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. We could have continued for a long time. Oh, there's one more question coming from Trine.
Sorry, just a follow-up. I think we should give a little bit of extra room for our colleagues not being here today. This is a question for Ingrid from Velux, but it relates to the question we've just heard, which is, how come you chose to focus on the global south rather than investing in Denmark or taking action in Denmark? So I just thought that's a good question to follow on.
Yeah, so of course we discussed that also during the many months that we've been sitting together. Without being an expert, I know that of course there are also biodiversity challenges in Denmark. The reason for choosing on the global south was the effectiveness of the carbon capture projects in the global south and the very positive effect on biodiversity. And then also, just from a purely internal point of view, we also have our foundation, which is very involved with the Danish Nature Found, etc., already very active. So we have an arm's length principle, which is part of the Danish legislation, where you have a foundation that you can't overlap. So that was also a very, very internal reason for that. But we based ourselves on the expertise and our good partners from WWF, and that's back to the whole partnership approach.
Excellent, thank you. And I'll leave that being the last word, which is actually resonating extremely well. Keywords, partnership, but also one's risk, another's opportunity, you told us. I think we can sum it up in the general recognition that natural-based solutions is definitely a tool that needs to be integrated in how we do development. So good development perhaps is one that is also more green as compared to what we've seen before. We've heard very specific proposals on what Denmark could do more. Should it be a committee or platform or process that could help create a debate around these issues that could inspire, some of the discussions around the strategy. A nature ambassador came up. I thought that was an interesting idea. If we know that we are dealing with planetary boundaries, and we do have on climate, should we have one on biodiversity and nature, perhaps? And what we also, I think, is learning. Leadership comes everywhere, from businesses that sees not only own interest, but also a more altruistic approach to what we just need to do. We see, I think, from global experience, where we do succeed at scale is where we have local ownership, local leadership. If you have that in place, you are very far. So that underscores what we also discussed, the need to talk and work with the communities, political leaders. And I think there's a big issue. We didn't delve too much into that, but there's an issue around competence. Competence in government, competence in businesses to understand what we are talking about is a key issue that need to be delved into. But as Stuart also said, the nature-based solutions is not a fixed and done toolbox. It's a framework that now needs to be given content and value and much more specific tools as we move forward. So a process has been started. The tent is open, and it's for our own curiosity to bring scale and speed forward as we walk away from this room in whatever role we have. We do have a responsibility to act. Having said that, thank you for your patience in every way, and have a great weekend. Thank you. Let's applaud our panelists. You can go home slowly, but not in one bundle by the door. Keep a distance.